All right, we are live. Okay, Jed and I are filling in for Mr. Nate Heil since he is not a little under the weather, I suppose. Let's call it that. He wanted to do a Q&A with some of the questions in the Discord server. I looked through them and I only see one question and a long conversation with a lot of other questions in it. So,
it's a huge question.
Yeah, because it's a huge question. So I read the question already to Jed, and do you think you can summarize it?
I think it would.
Do you want me to read
summarize it? I'm afraid I wouldn't do justice to it. I don't mind. I think it'd be all right if you read it, just
Okay.
so we get a sense of it and the people viewing get a sense of it.
Okay, this question is from Elan Vital. Or Elon Vital, however you want to say that. I have a philosophical question for Grail Country. In Catholic theology and Orthodox too, I believe, Christ's redemption of humanity, and I would argue beyond, entails the notion that nature, in its redemption and deification, is perfected, not destroyed by grace. This would seem to work positively in all those areas that are not explicitly primarily the result of revelation in the narrow sense, such as philosophy, the sciences, secular or not explicitly Christian culture, and so on. All these realms of human activity, if they touched upon truth, cannot contradict revelation and vice versa, as Thomas would argue. But also they would presumably be brought to their perfection by the infusion of grace via integration of revealed truths. Example, if you follow Teilhard de Chardin, you see the scientific data of evolution and correct and expand it to arrive at a fuller truth, whereby evolution is itself the means through which God draws creation closer to him. My question is there something circular about claiming that nature is not destroyed but perfected by grace? And then he kind of that's the question. Why don't we just stop there? Because I could read on, but then we might lose the question if I read on.
Yeah.
So the question is there something circular about claiming that nature is not destroyed but perfected by grace?
I don't, well, first of all, I think like to back up into the question, like I'm not answering this from a Catholic perspective.
Yeah.
I worship with the Episcopal Church here in America, and my background is decidedly not Catholic. But I come from a Reformed perspective that holds a similar nature grace distinction to the Catholic tradition. They pick up on that and develop it a little bit, but not much beyond Thomas Aquinas. So,
can you enlighten me on that distinction? Because I don't know what it is.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll give my take on it, and mind you, I'm not a systematic theologian. So,
yeah.
Like the shorthand take on it is the short take on it is that there's a distinction between nature and grace, right? And a lot of this, it develops especially more in the Western traditions than it does in the East. And that without an act of grace, there is no redemption for nature. It takes a supernatural work of grace to come in. And so supernature has to intervene in the course and destiny of nature in order to draw nature into itself. So,
okay. So when we're talking, let me just clarify. When we're talking about nature, we're talking about like trees and animals and the earth, or are we talking about human nature? What are we talking about?
Yes. Yes.
Both. Okay.
Both. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think specifically, like you can, like it filters into like arguments surrounding doctrines of salvation, right? Can man come to God unaided by grace, or is it in man's nature to seek God? The Reformed tradition, and this also comes out of certain aspects in Catholic tradition would say, no, man does not by nature seek God. It takes an act of grace in order for man to seek after God, kind of thing. And I mean, in its most like simple form, I think it's a fairly benign and helpful observation to draw the distinction between nature and grace. But I think that the way that the West partitions those things, it makes it seem as if nature is fallen and devoid
cut
of
off
grace,
and
right?
and cut off in a sense.
Yeah, cut off from grace. And so grace has to jump in. Hey guys, how you doing? Grace has to jump in and basically transfigure nature in order to bring nature into itself. And what isn't circular? Squares? Yeah, so just to like tip my hat to Luke, yes, I think that in a sense it's like grace / nature. I look at it as more of a continuum where things always begin in nature, but it's the seeds of grace are sown in nature from the very beginning. And I
Well,
think
what about the whole idea of the creaturely Sophia and the divine Sophia? Like, where does the creaturely
that I
Sophia
like it.
dwell?
I like that distinction a lot better because like as
Yeah,
opposed to looking at it in these dualisms of nature and grace, which really is not a concept that is I think it's probably foreign to both the New Testament and the Old Testament in
I think
terms of
so.
in that concept. But the idea of the wisdom of God being manifest, I find personally much more of a rooted organic understanding is like a seed. There's a seed form of our existence, and then there's the full bloom, right? And there are different stages in the development of what a thing is. Like so, so like creaturely Sophia is growing into herself, but only because she's the mirror image of the divine Sophia. She's the finite,
Right, and is
Sophia
called
in the
into
finite
and is
form or
called
modality.
by it,
Yeah.
right?
And so I don't think that there's like, look, I love the ideas of Teilhard de Chardin a lot. I do think that in terms of, I can't vouch for it entirely how well his theories mesh with kind of the theory of evolution as it currently stands. But the idea that there's this movement in evolution, the universe is evolving toward the omega point. I do think that evolution plays a role in that. And so, I mean, I think consciousness follows the same kind of pattern. So I like his ideas. But in terms of drawing that hard distinction between nature and grace, I don't find that to be very useful. I really like David Bentley Hart's book, You Are Gods, that takes on that question. I think, it's almost hard for me to recap his argument. But essentially, I think that the problem that the nature grace division brings into it is a fundamental misunderstanding of the relation between the finite and the infinite. And I see those in a dance. That's not like
Yeah,
it's
totally.
not like a set of abstract categories, but more of a relationship that is, expressed
Yeah.
between all parties involved. And I think grace absolutely meets us in that. I just don't think that ultimately, I don't think nature and grace are ultimately different things, two sides of the same coin. So I don't know. What are your thoughts, Shari?
Well, I feel like totally incapable of tackling that question because I don't even think in those kinds of
Yeah.
categories, like I don't think about what if and whether and either or. And let me see here, I copy pasted this in here. And I don't know the work of Teilhard de Chardin, and I don't know the doctrine of grace in the Reformed, Orthodox, or Catholic faiths. All I know is what I know. What I know.
Mm-hmm.
And recently I think it was kind of like on the tail end of this question in that Discord chat. I put in the verse from Job 12. It says, "But now ask the beasts and let them teach you, and the birds of the heavens and let them tell you, or speak to the earth and let it teach you, and let the fish of the sea declare to you, who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this?" Okay. So, I mean, and I can only speak from my own personal experience, right? That when my animals look at me, they have a deeper knowledge than I do. You know, Matthias Desmet says, and I put that in this conversation too that was being had on the Discord, a little clip from a conversation he had. But you know, he said human beings are we think we're the only ones who know, but essentially we're the only ones who don't know, because we're the ones who ask, who are we? Who am I? And what is my purpose? And you know, and he gave the example. He said, you know, you'll never see a dog or a giraffe sitting on a park bench overlooking the ocean asking, who am I and what is my purpose? Right? And we might think, oh, that's cute, but it's actually true. It's actually true. And so because I have such a lifelong relationship with animals, I see, and I don't mean to diminish anybody in this at all. I see myself in the same category, but I see us as being very naive and very childlike in comparison to them. They meet life head on. Like they never think, I won't be able to have a child. I don't think I could raise it. I don't know how I would manage that. They don't think those things, you know, and when they're dying and they die. It's a process, right? I mean, we've all seen horrible wildlife footage of some animal being eaten alive by wolves.
Yeah.
You know, and I remember once my dogs went after one of my goats, and what they do is they run them down. And so what they do is they nip at their hind legs, and what it does is it traumatizes the tissue in their muscle, and then they go down and they can't actually stand up anymore because the muscle tissue is so damaged, right? And I was in the kitchen and I was doing dishes, and I looked out and I saw the dogs standing beside this goat, 2 dogs, and I had one of them was a new dog, okay, a German Shepherd, and they were standing beside this goat, staring at it, and she was laying in the field in a very odd place, like, you know, alone, right, not with the herd. And I thought, what is going on? That is not normal. So I marched out there, you know, and sure enough, they were waiting for their moment. They were just sitting there, all three of them, waiting for the moment to happen, right? And you know, I've had does die of, you know, after childbirth, after giving birth due to complications, you know, suckling their kids and while wobbling on their last legs, you know.
Yeah.
And then finally just going down and getting the thing done, the dying done, you know. I don't see people doing stuff like that. They're just, oh my God, you know, and I'm dying, and you know, and they need morphine, and you know, when I think about it, and I don't know, people, you know, some people would say, well, that's because we're conscious. Well, I don't know how less conscious animals are.
So I have a question, and it kind of like, because I'm wondering, like, I mean, my first question is an absurd one, and you don't have to answer it, but it's more of like, what do you think animals think then? But there's another question behind
Yeah,
that, or just my own sense is I think that part
I
of the
haven't gotten
reason
that far yet.
why we get there, one contributing factor I think that sets us apart, at least significantly from the animals, is just our interface with technology, because the animals typically their only interface with nature is their body, right? And so I
Yeah,
wonder
well,
if
but I mean, I've got a workhorse that, you know, hooks up to technologies,
this
so
is
to speak.
true. I
And
was thinking
he
more,
knows how to do it. Like,
yeah,
he knows what's happening.
yeah.
Like,
I
he
was thinking more
actually
in the
and
terms
they're
of wild animals, but
yeah, well, I mean,
but I mean, it's not like animals are incapable of it. I mean, they even see like chimpanzees showing the signs of tool usage, and
oh, yeah, and
otters use it
ravens.
when they smash the
Oh,
shellfish on their
yeah,
uh,
bears, if you've ever seen a bear try to roll o over a log,
mhm,
I mean, they do it just like a human being. They actually have the same bodily anatomy, like, if you skin a bear
mhm,
and hang it, looks like a human being.
hmm,
Yeah. Like, it has the same kind of anatomy in a sense, right? Like, the
yeah,
musculature, and that's why they can walk upright, you know?
yeah,
Um, I mean, I don't know what animals think, um, but I think that I get a sense from the interactions that I've had, and I've had interactions with both wild and domesticated animals.
mhm,
I've rescued a lot of wild animals. And they don't actually deal with these more um, important issues like dying and so on, and injury, because most of the wild animals that I have looked after were injured
mhm,
or died of their injuries. And they all seem to deal with it in the same way. There's a resolve there. There's a knowing.
mhm,
That's how I would that's how I would explain it.
mhm,
Um, and see, this is what Desmond says. He says, "We are marked by our unknowing, not by our knowing." Right? This is what distinct makes us distinct from animals. And I always knew that, but I never articulated it like that before. And I thought that is really interesting. That's an interesting way to talk about it.
mhm.
Because we tend to assume, because we have language and we can operate StreamYard and have
So,
conversations, that we know stuff, right? I know stuff.
uh-huh,
But essentially, when it comes to our existence, we don't know anything. We're really quite like babes in a way, right? Compared
mhm,
to animals. Like, they don't have to be they don't need to go to Wolf University, Moose University, and get a degree in herbivore or
mhm,
carnivore
yeah,
kind of thing. And they do learn, like I've seen dogs and goats learn. Um, so I had a dog once, and I was getting the goats used to the dog because it was new, and it was a puppy.
mhm,
And she was on my lap, and the goats, it was in the fall, and there's this one plant that has white berries on it, and the goats don't eat that plant at all until the berries come on it, and then they eat the berries.
mhm,
And we were sitting in those plants, and so the goats were all around us, and they were picking those berries off, and the dog was intently watching. And as soon as the goats moved away, the dog got off my lap, was a puppy,
mhm.
went over and pulled the berries off the plant just like the goat did. And I was like, "What?" Just learned that from watching.
Mhm,
I broke a horse once. It was a foal that I had, and whenever I would saddle his mother, I'd turn around to get the saddle, and he'd pull the blanket off. And then I'd put the blanket on, and then I'd go grab the saddle, and he'd pull it off of her, right? And so finally one day I thought, "Do you want this on?" And so I put it on him, and he pranced around like the proudest little thing you've ever seen, right?
mhm,
Anyway, long story short, when that guy was of age, I saddled him up and rode him one day and never trained him ever.
hmm.
And that he learned everything by watching.
Hmm.
You know, he had to learn to feel the bit in his mouth, and he had to learn, you know, whoa and go and all that stuff. But as far as freaking out when you throw the saddle on and, you know, tighten the cinch and jump in, he was fine. He was fine with it.
That's so interesting.
Watching. And then I started picking blueberries, and my goats had never discovered blueberries before. And suddenly, one of my goats watched me, and she got right down and saw what I was doing, and she found a blueberry and she tasted it, and then she loved it. And then I couldn't go blueberry picking with my goats anymore, because as soon as we got to a patch, she ate everything,
Oh, I bet.
plant and all. But before that, I was picking blueberries while they were grazing on willows, because
Yeah.
they didn't care. But she
Yeah.
suddenly learned, oh, what do you have? You got something that I don't have. I've got 3 horses. Okay, here's my last example. And in the morning, I grain them, and I have like a big can, and I measure 6 cans into a bucket, and they each get 2 cans full, right?
Hmm.
Well, it's a race in the morning, because I've got to make sure that everybody has the same amount, because whoever has more than the other, that's where they all want to eat. They actually can tell who's got more and who's got less.
So it sounds like my children.
Yeah, exactly. And when you've had kids, you recognize that, right?
Mhm.
Right away. So
Yeah.
anyway, there's a bunch of little stories, but
Yeah, I'm not sure how that connects to the nature grace thing, but I like the stories. You know, I don't know. I mean, so I mean, I guess I can throw out a few questions here, Shari, because I think it's a subject that you probably will have some interesting thoughts on.
Mm.
But actually, this comes out of some of the conversations I had with Luke recently over on my channel the last time we talked, or on this channel. I don't remember if it was this channel or the other channel, wherever we talked.
I think you talked on yours, yeah.
Yeah. So like I've been one of my goals, like just in terms of personal study during Lent, is to just kind of work through the cries at the cross. So Jesus cries at the cross.
Mm.
And Luke and I had talked about um, Jesus's cry of dereliction. My God, why have you forsaken me?
Mhm.
Um, and I've been connecting that to some of, like, I've been slowly chipping away at reading bits and pieces of Meister Eckhart, but I've been listening to some lectures on uh, Kabbalah and Eckhart, and then into Burma. Like,
Mhm.
all of them have these, concepts. They kind of, in some senses, echo Dionysus, this idea of some kind of divine darkness,
Mm.
or the divine abyss, or the divine wilderness, the being beyond being, however we want to put it, the dark part, essentially, the silence. Um, and so I've been thinking about that idea of, like, so Slavoj Žižek will talk about how at the cross God becomes an atheist, and he's
Yeah,
using
I heard that.
Chesterton's terminology before.
Mhm.
He's using Chesterton's terminology. And I think you can take that in some ways that are probably correct, in some ways that are probably not correct.
Mhm.
But I find that, if you grant the Christian doctrines around Christ, what I found was interesting is that God is present in his absence, right? Because we can't divide God away from Christ when he's on the cross.
Right.
And uh, and in God's absence, the human being is present. And, like, I was thinking about that in terms of, like, we always think of, like, manifestation as, like, what is manifest, what is clear, what is open, and it's kind of this positive knowing,
Mhm.
as that's what revelation is. But I was looking at it in another light, where God's hiddenness, or his darkness, or his absence, or whatever we want to call it, when God seems to leave town for a while, right? Um, I think that in itself that negative space is a revelation. It is its own kind of
Yeah.
manifestation.
Yeah, I think so. I think
And
so.
so I mean, I don't know if like any of those thoughts connect into a coherent question so much as kind of painting a little bit of a picture of like, what do we make of that cry of dereliction, and how does that, how does that comport with how we grapple with God's absence, maybe in our own experience, or
Well,
anything, or run with those ideas wherever you want, because I'm sure you.
yeah, like the thing on the my God, why hast thou forsaken me on the cross is interesting. What comes to my mind, Jed, is the phrase that John Bear loves to throw out there. Jesus Christ shows us what it is to be God in the way that he dies as a human being. Okay.
Mhm.
And Jacob, Facciarecci, who, from the other Discord, from the Bridges of Meaning Discord,
Okay.
him and I had a conversation one time about this cry of dereliction, because it's actually Psalm, I think it's 21 in the Jewish scriptures and 22 in ours or something.
I think it, yeah.
And
I think
so
it's 22.
he was telling me that the Psalms are known not by their numbers in Hebrew, but by their first line. And that's the first line of that Psalm. So essentially, Jesus is crying out Psalm 21, right?
Mhm.
Because this is what's happening to him. And so if you take that idea and then think about what John Bear says, he
Mhm.
shows us what it is to be God in the way that he dies as a
The human.
human being.
Yeah, it's one of
And so,
Bear's most interesting insights. I love that insight of his.
yeah. And so how would a human being feel hanging on that cross? Forsaken, right? Alone.
Mhm.
And so for me, I mean, I don't get caught up in the, yeah, but, isn't he God? And, and I just want to take it for what it is, Um, Jesus suffered just as Job suffered, just
Mhm.
as Jonah suffered, just as Isaiah suffered, just as they all suffered, right? As we all suffer, because that is the human condition. That is it. And then about the silence, what I find interesting about that, and I think that's also very personal to the individual, when they're going through something and they sense a silence from God. It could be for different reasons. Maybe they have a sin in their life and they know it, maybe they need to deal with something. Maybe they need to forgive somebody. Maybe they need to, but I ultimately, though, I think it really boils down to this: is what do you want? What do you want to do? It's empowerment. It's letting go of the bicycle, so to speak,
Mhm.
right? And saying, okay, have you got this? You think you can do this? Right? Because there's only, so I had a friend once, and when he first became a Christian, he was so into the whole discerning God's will thing
Mhm.
that when he got up in the morning to get dressed, he'd say, should I wear this suit or this suit?
Mhm.
You know, and then God would tell him, and then he'd say, should I wear this tie or that tie with it? You know, and he said to me, God entertained him for the longest time and gave him an answer for all these dumb questions. And then one day, silence. Silence, right?
Mhm.
And what he decided was that it was time for him to grow up and
Mhm.
stop asking his dad for every little, there's a trust there in like I've said to Jess regarding Job, the reason that God isn't worried about Job from the start is because he knows the process, right? He knows the process.
Yeah.
And it's really not that different than our children.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they go horribly wrong, and they're really struggling, there's only so much that you can do, and then you have to let go, right?
Yeah. Yes. Well, and I think we have to, like, I think that's, in Jesus's cry, I think that, like, well, the Psalm 22 is not a song of lament. It's a victory song. It actually, if you read through the whole thing, it's actually a
You
psalm.
should read it.
Yeah. Let me see if I got my, I don't know.
But it is
Bible.
descriptive of suffering, isn't it?
Oh, it does. Absolutely. But it is
Yeah.
interesting. Like, I agree with Jacob that when when Jesus is citing a psalm, he's generally pulling in the whole context as well. I think
Right.
that is what he's doing, because in his dereliction is his victory.
Right.
Let me see. I'm going to go grab, I'm just going to
I've got it here if you want me to read it.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? O my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not, and in the night season, and am not silent. But thou art holy, O thou that inhabitest the praises of Israel. Apparently, I have the King James Version here. Sorry.
Perfect. Even better.
Our fathers trusted in thee. They trusted, and thou didst deliver them. They cried unto thee and were delivered. They trusted in thee and were not confounded. But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men and despised of the people. All they that see me laugh me to scorn. They shoot out the lip, they shake the head, saying, He trusted on the Lord that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, seeing he delighted in him. But thou art he that took me out of the womb. Thou didst make me hope when I was upon my mother's breasts. I was cast upon thee from the womb. Thou art my God from my mother's belly. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, but there is none to help. Many bulls have compassed me. Strong bulls of Bashan have beset me round. They gaped upon me with their mouths as a ravening and a roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaws. And thou hast brought me into the dust of death. For dogs have compassed me. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I may tell all my bones. They look and stare upon me. They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture. But be not thou far from me, O Lord. O my strength, haste thee to help me. Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, for thou hast heard me from the horns of the unicorns. I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the congregation will I praise thee. Ye that fear the Lord, praise him. All ye the seed of Jacob, glorify him, and fear him, all ye the seed of Israel. For he hath not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, neither hath he hid his face from him. But when he cried unto him, he heard. My praise shall be of thee in the great congregation. I will pay my vows before them that fear him. The meek shall eat and be satisfied. They shall praise the Lord that seek him. Your heart shall live forever. All the ends of the world shall remember and turn unto the Lord, and all the kindreds of the nations shall worship before thee. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he is the governor among nations. All they that be fat upon earth shall eat and worship. All they that go down to the dust shall bow before him, and none can keep alive his own soul. A seed shall serve him. It shall be accounted to the Lord for a generation. They shall come and shall declare his righteousness unto a people that shall be born, that he hath done this. Turns around pretty quickly at the end there, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah, there's this like delightful tendency like in the Psalms for the psalmist to, spend a good portion of the psalm just either
Mhm.
crying out to God or berating God or, any number of dark subjects that they have to explore. But then it turns.
Yeah.
There's this turn toward the triumph and like,
Well,
what,
it's like a resurrection. Who would have
yeah,
thought? But it's like that, like Jess talks about the U-shaped journey, right? There's this birth, and then there's a death, and then there's a resurrection. And yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, continue. I want to hear your thoughts on that.
No, I think that like, there's something interesting about that I'm gonna have to go back to. I'm gonna have to spend some time in the Psalm actually. That since you read it, I'm like, man, it's been a long time since I've studied Psalm 22.
Mhm.
So
It's a
there's
lot
there's a
there.
there's a lot in there, but I feel like one of the like if you take the through line, that cry at the very beginning, the cry of dereliction is the is the invocation of the absent God to be present and
It's
to show
yeah,
himself forth.
right.
And
Jess talks about this because when I was reading this, I was thinking of Job. Because Job says a lot of these things too, right? I'm
mhm,
a worm. All they that see me laugh me to scorn. They say, oh, it's a very similar story. And um, when
Lance said
Job,
it here. I don't know if I can put the comments up, but you might be able to.
you got a Lance comment? I don't
Lance
have one.
comment at 437. Lance says it's a remembering
It's a remembering. You mean the psalm?
the psalm. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's a remembering. I don't have it yet for some reason. Maybe it hasn't come in. My
I had to
internet might be really
refresh. I had to
slow.
refresh the feed. I went over into the private chat, then into the comments, and then presto change it came up.
Oh, look at that. Let me try that. Okay. There it is. Look at that. There we go. Yeah. Now what did I want to say? Oh, I know. Jess talks about how when a baby is born, it just cries, right?
Hmm.
And those cries are for sustenance, right? Because it's so helpless. Like
Hmm.
it comes out of the womb and it's probably a cry of dereliction. Like what it's just been through has been like hell, right? And now it's not in that cozy, oneness, right?
Hmm.
Now it's out in bright lights with loud noises and cold air, and it's terrifying, right?
Yeah.
And it cries out, and the parents are there. They hear that, right?
Yeah.
And they do all the things that the child needs, even though the child has no clue what it needs.
Yeah.
I think that's a good representation, actually. Of what it is to be. Like I've always thought that Job, the book of Job, is the creation story from a human perspective, from the
Hmm.
perspective of being a human being,
Yeah.
right? What it means to be made real.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a it's a I think back to your example of your friend who would ask God how to do everything. What do you want me to do next? What do you want me to do next? What do you want me to do next? And the absence and the silence is one function of that is to put us up on our feet and to make us make our decisions for ourselves, even when we don't feel that divine connection at all. And sometimes that's, if you always like to return to, Lance's comment of it's a remembering is when in memory, when you look at those times in your life where God seemed totally absent, you can see that he was totally present, fully present,
Mhm.
but you can't see it in the moment. You can only see it through memory.
Right.
And, and you realize that sometimes like that absence of, that absence of manifestation is an invitation to something different.
Mm-hmm.
Is an invitation into the yoke of suffering, or the yoga of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Is there's a discipline with that we want to come into. I think the Lord wants us to get into a place where there's an evenness of mind, where whether we feel his presence or not, and I'm saying this as a guy who's manic depressive, so they're all over the place, whether I feel this way or that way,
Yeah.
I have my choices to make.
Mm.
And like, I am an active agent in my own life.
Mm-hmm.
And that God wants me to grow up.
Mm-hmm.
And this
Yeah.
is how it happens.
Yeah.
And it's like, and I think like one of the things like my girlfriend always, she doesn't come out of an evangelical background. And, so she constantly makes fun of me for my like overdeveloped sense of guilt. It's almost like Catholic guilt, just a different flavor.
It's got a harder edge on it, I think.
Yeah, it's got some sauce on it for sure.
Yeah.
And so like I realized that, like, so much of the maturation process of growing and becoming what we are is going to entail bumping against some walls and knocking your head on the ground, and like the same kind of thing that we expect from a toddler when they're learning to walk, God, I think, expects from us as we grow in him.
Yeah.
And that's enclosed within a process of grace. I find that that process of like the darkness is like, it's where like a seed grows in darkness, right? And it's like where we, how we end up becoming who and what we are.
Mm-hmm.
Before it can break the ground into the light, it has to germinate in the darkness.
Yeah. And
it's
okay,
gotta die. It gets split in half and it dies, and then it sprouts to life.
Yeah, like I've got George MacDonald's imagination essay, because we're going through it at the moment. And you're talking about this absence, right? And this came to my mind. I'll just read it to you from MacDonald in the essay. Let me see here if I can find. Poet means maker. We must not forget, however, that between creator and poet lies the one unpassable gulf which distinguishes all that is God's from all that is man's. A gulf teeming with infinite revelations, but a gulf over which no man can pass to find out God, although God needs not to pass over it to find man. And this is what the gulf is. It is the gulf between that which calls and that which is thus called into being, between that which makes in its own image and that which is made in that image. So what I like about this is that, and Luke Johnston actually made this point, that it's this gap that God doesn't have to. God has access to us at all times, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we don't.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have access to God over it, right? It's filled with infinite revelations, right? And those are our, in sense, I get that. I mean, I might be wrong about this, but I think those are our stepping stones, right? These infinite revelations. But the gulf is that gulf between that which calls and that which is called into being, right? Mm-hmm. And at the beginning of the essay here, MacDonald says, where is it? I'll just read this opening paragraph. There's Luke. Luke, if you want to join us, you can, I'll just put a link in the chat here. There we go. So the first paragraph, he says, there are those in whose notion education would seem to consist in the production of a certain repose through the development of this and that faculty. So, you're supposed to get your education and then just rest on your laurels, right? Kind of thing. But if mere repose were the end in view, an unsparing depression of all the faculties would be the surest means of approaching it, provided always the animal instincts could be depressed likewise, or better still, kept in a state of constant repletion. Happily, however, for the human race, it possesses in the passion of hunger even a more immediate savior than in the wisest selection and treatment of its faculties. For repose is not the end of education. Its end is a noble unrest, an ever-renewed awaking from the dead, a ceaseless questioning of the past for the interpretation of the future, an urging on of the motions of life, which had better far be accelerated into fever than retarded into lethargy. And I would go so far as to say that I think George MacDonald thinks that's what the Christian life is supposed to be like too, right? It's one of, there's no repose. It's one of noble unrest that is supposed to be accelerating into a fevered pitch, right? Then to be retarded into lethargy. And so this gulf, this absence, right? Between that which calls and that which is called, it's the insurance that repose never happens because he talks about the imagination or attention as being a stretching too, right? So as soon as you give your attention to something, you're almost trying to get across that gulf, right?
You know what's interesting is that he is saying in his own language exactly what Gregory of Nyssa says.
Really?
So, like well, in this respect, when he's talking about the ever stretching out, that's what the word epictasis means. And so it's the outward ever stretching out that is a part of the human experience of the divine life. Now, I wrote a poem a long time ago. I was trying, not super long, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. It was my long one, and I really loved writing it. It was probably, of anything I've ever done, it's what I'm most proud of. But I was dealing with this concept of dance, and it was from, I took an experience in a nightclub where I met a really pretty girl. We had a great time, and when I accidentally didn't save her number in my cell phone, right? So I had this wonderful time with this lovely girl, and that was it.
Cinderella.
Yeah. And so, it was just, it came into my memory as I was writing this piece about kind of the divine dance, and there's a certain kind of eroticism that I was teasing out in that that piece. But like the way I understand, like even like divine simplicity and the idea of divine rest is, if you're saying that God is perfectly at rest, what else is that but to say he's perfectly at motion? And so the way I describe that is the ever moving stillness, right? And I think it's like it's the mirroring, right? The motion and the stillness are the mirroring of the same thing. And I think that like what MacDonald's talking about there is, I think he's capturing that energetic aspect of the outstretching. There is that ecstatic movement upward and inward and onward. Right.
Yeah. For him, it requires, how does he put it? Which had better far be accelerated into fever.
Yeah.
Like he wants you to go for it, right? A ceaseless questioning of the past for the interpretation of the future, an urging on of the motions of life, which had better far be accelerated into fever than retarded into lethargy. Yeah. And he's talking about education there, but I think he also would say that that's what the Christian life is, right? That is, because I don't know if it's MacDonald that says, I mean, if he says further in or further up, but one of those he uses, and then it's Lewis that snatches that and adds his secondary one to it, and you get the further up, further in, right?
Yeah.
So
I mean, I think it's I think that excites me. I think that's become like, yeah, Luke, we need to have some conversations on imagination as well, Luke. We got.
Well, you know what I'm just thinking, Jed. I don't know if you have the time, but we're meeting on Thursdays, sometimes Fridays at 7, my time, your time.
Oh, okay.
And we're discussing this essay. So we've already done 2 episodes on Grail Country.
Okay.
And it's been so amazing. And like sometimes we get 3 paragraphs, sometimes we only get 2,
Yeah.
but we're just taking our time through it, right?
Yeah, I was in a conversation with Luke and Jason a few months ago, and like I don't think that these guys, maybe they know, maybe they don't, but like when I talk with you or Nate or Luke or Jason, or these have like a profound impact on my thinking.
Mm.
And sometimes you can discover in a conversation what you can't discover anywhere else.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why I'm doing it. I'm doing it with Jason and Luke.
Yeah.
The imagination.
And we talked about the imagination, and like I came to a sense of, I think that there is a correspondence, and a Trinitarian correspondence to the structure of where imagination fits within just the divine economy. Right? Is that, you have 3 things that always have to be present in the creative process. You have to have imagination, you have to have the image, and you have to have the inspiration. And so it's, in a sense, the Trinity is the vehicle through which the imagination is realized in all things. It's the Father who thinks them, and in the Son they're spoken as the image, as the living image, and the Spirit is the inspiration. And all these are simultaneities within God. But for us, we can see them as somewhat separate. Somewhat, they're not entirely separate, but we talked about the idea of imagination is the spiritual vision.
Right.
And it was, it made me think of, in that conversation, it made me think of some of the writings of Margaret Barker on the Holy of Holies and what it's like. It's essentially a much more ornately decorated concept but it corresponds to Plato's forms, Platonic forms, the divine ideas. And so the imagination is the going up there and seeing it through the imagination, to see it, and then to bring it back here in the world, in the world below.
Well, it's interesting, Matthew Pajot made the point in one of his conversations. What, I can't remember. Derek Fiedler, that heaven is the above, right? It's what's above, and so like your head, your consciousness, your imagination is heaven, right? It's not the only heaven, right? Like there's lots of heaven, right? It's whatever's up above. That which is above is heaven. But like George MacDonald says here, when it comes to the imagination, he says, the imagination of man is made in the image of the imagination of God. Everything of man must have been of God first, and it will help much towards our understanding of the imagination and its function in man if we first succeed in regarding aright the imagination of God, in which the imagination of man lives and moves and has its being. And I would say that is made manifest in creation, right? Because that's where God's imagination is manifested,
Mhm.
in creation. And that is where we live and move and have our being, right?
Mhm.
I mean, that's one of the places, one of the dimensions of our
Mhm.
living and moving and having our being is within creation itself, which is, and then he goes on to say that he talks about forms and figurations, and
Mhm.
he goes on to say that the forms are those of nature, right?
Mhm.
And our imagination is the light that
Mhm.
lights the lamp within the forms, because the forms already contain the meaning.
Mhm.
And then he goes on to expound on how that's where the half of our language comes from,
Mhm.
right? From those forms,
Mhm.
because it's talking to us about our microcosm, about what's going on inside of us.
Mhm.
Like it's huge. Like it's huge. This whole idea of imagination, right?
Mhm.
If you have it right, but he does make the distinction between the fancy and the imagination.
Yeah, there is a difference.
Hmm. He
There's,
likes Coleridge's distinction.
and I think that Coleridge's distinction is correct, and people, because I think that there's a tendency to denigrate what the imagination is, but if you understand kind of the inner structure of imagination, you realize that it is the structure of creation.
Hmm.
If you've ever had to create anything at all, and
Hmm.
people do this all the time, they don't even think about it. I mean, if you are making a batch of cookies, right?
Hmm.
You have to start with the idea in your head. Maybe it's a craving, even just the chocolate chip cookie sounds good. You picture it in your mind, you can taste it, but then you have to take all of those intangible senses and make it tangible,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
And
it's
this
not
is what
even, we do that all the time without thinking about it
right.
or thinking of the significance of what we do, but there's almost no motion toward any productive activity without some kind of imagination and inspiration, whether that's a good inspiration or a bad one.
Well,
That's
what's even more fascinating, Jed, is that the imagination is infinite, right? Because you can imagine anything. Like I
yes.
said to Luke and Jason, in your imagination, pigs can fly, right? You
And in
can
some universes they do. Chad, what's up going? How you doing, Chad?
but but what you do when you create something is that you take from that infinite and you make it finite, right?
Yeah.
So you make the infinite finite, and it becomes incarnated.
Hmm.
Um, and it's incarnation, right? Because it's been created by you, it's
Hmm.
now it's embodied, right? That
Yeah.
this infinite thing that you chose from your imagination has become finite and incarnated.
Yeah. Hmm.
So yeah.
But I think that we like, so to kind of circle back to like one of the interesting, if I think back to the idea of like, what do animals think kind of thing that we
Mhm.
were talking about here. I'm thinking of like just in Genesis 1, I was listening to a lecture on it by a critical Hebrew scholar, by critical Old Testament scholar Richard Elliott Friedman, and he was talking about how the ancient peoples perceived the gods. Right? Is we think Zeus, the god of thunder, or the
Mhm.
god of like the god of the sky.
Mhm.
But to the ancients, Zeus simply was the sky. Poseidon simply was the sea.
Right,
Hades
right,
simply
right,
was
right.
the underworld, right? And and you have this like tantalizing divine plural in the Hebrew text in Genesis 1 of Elohim. And God,
Mhm, mhm.
says, and Elohim says, "Let us make man in our image." I do think the one God is speaking there, but if you allow for the existence of the created or lesser gods, is they, in a sense, they have like a certain authority over the cosmic functions: sky, land, sea, all the different ranges of creation are represented by some kind of deity that has jurisdiction over them in the
You know, when
ancient
I was a
world.
child, there was a deity in my life that had a jurisdiction. It was natural. We had a pond
Mm-hmm.
on our property where we lived, and this is when I was really, like, I don't know, from like grade 1 to grade 4 or something. And in the wintertime, when that pond was frozen, we would go visit Mrs. Ice, and she was the pond.
Mm-hmm.
She was the pond. Like, she didn't live in the pond. She was the pond.
Yeah. So that's exactly how the ancients would have viewed deity.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, of course, they kind of take on their own personality and that kind of stuff. And,
Yeah, she had a personality. I knew exactly what she looked like, actually.
oh, okay. Very nice.
And, yeah. And and she
But
would
that we're
call.
created. So when we're created in the image of God and the gods, I think, because I think that the text hints at that, at least lends itself to this idea of God and the angels, if you want to be more reverent,
Mhm.
is that we're the living image of the finite and the infinite, of the created and the uncreated. That's what makes a human unique, which is a tremendous problem and a huge set of shoes to grow into. So I think that's where, the idea of like, why are animals in some senses more advanced than us? It's because we have a lot further to go. And maybe so do they. Who knows? I can't speak for the animals,
Yeah.
but I think that there's a sense of like, we are that living image of the finite and the infinite, and that in us is the sky and the sea and and the underworld and all these things, and they're inside of us, right? And in a very Jungian kind of way, I think Jung is just saying something in a kind of a modern way that earlier human civilizations already felt, that deep connection to what's within them. And it kind of, I don't know, it kind of connects in a sense when Jesus says, like, the kingdom of the heavens. You're talking about the heavens being above, and you're right, absolutely. But what's really interesting is he says it's within us.
Yeah. Well,
And so
yeah.
it's like there's nowhere where you can, like,
Yeah, but
heaven is always everywhere present.
that's the idea of as above, so below, right?
Mm-hmm.
On earth as it is in heaven,
Mm-hmm.
right? And this is, getting back to our thing on Saturday. This is why the Theotokos is so important.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just did the Compline service, and at the end of every, I don't know what they call them, you know, there's a lot of kneeling and bowing and Lord have mercies, and and then he's reading. It's a repentance. It's kind of like a heavily repentant liturgy,
Mm-hmm.
and at the end of it, he always punctuates everything with the Theotokos. Just a line about her, like that that she bore the God into the world, that she, and for me, when I'm participating, what I'm hearing is the grounding back, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you don't float off into la la land, right? It's no, now you're grounded back, because and this is why I think Jesus's nature as divine and human is so important.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why the fathers couldn't let that just slide, right? Because because yeah, because we are, like you said, the finite and the infinite. That's what we are, and we have to be reminded of it,
Mm-hmm.
because we want to fly away, right?
Yeah.
We want to be Gnostic. We want to get away from the thing that this yoke of suffering that
Mm-hmm.
that we have to live with, this human condition, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and the lack of knowing, like, this is why I think heaven is what Paul says when he says, we see through a glass darkly, but one day we shall know as we are known.
Mm-hmm.
That's heaven to me. That's the
Mm-hmm.
perfect description of heaven, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the one thing we don't know. is who we are. We don't. We think we do, but we don't, you know? And that's the difference I see between human beings and animals. There's never a question, about who they are.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's we totally got off. I don't even know if we answered the question. Did we?
I think we got like to half of one question. I feel like that's
Grace and
a good
nature.
start.
There was only one question that I could find. If Nate finds more, he can do his own Q&A. But I could only find one, and then a whole conversation around the one question.
And it was like a nature and grace question is what we were addressing in the beginning.
Yeah. So that's what it is. Mm-hmm. Does anybody in the chat have a question? How about an ask us anything?
Oh, goodness gracious. Could be dangerous.
We don't have to answer it, but you can
absolutely.
In Swiss they have a saying, asking is free. Doesn't cost anything. Come on, guys. Ask a question. To refresh my comments here and see. Everybody's scared to ask a question.
No questions yet.
Yeah. Oh, here we go.
Do monsters in the basement exist? Yes. But they may not exist in the basement the way we think they do. Like the upside down basement, Chad. It's definitely a real place. But yeah, so I have to kind of back up there. Like I would say like I take some of like McDonald's ideas on the imagination to the extreme. I think pretty much anything in the realm of actual imagination, not fancy, but imagination, I think it exists.
Yeah.
And so like I think all kinds of things exist that we think are imaginary.
Excuse me.
It's just our minds touching upon that world of that imaginary world, the world of the images or the forms, and
this is when you
reading it.
This is when you start asking. This is when you're like stoned on acid, and you're like, "Is this real?"
Yeah.
And everyone goes, "It's real, man.
Yeah,
it's totally real."
Yeah, I mean, I do try to live in that kind of like somewhat permanent psychedelic state. I mean, I don't do psychedelics, but I like to be in that frame of mind.
Oh yeah.
I find it much more interesting.
I don't think I've ever. Yeah, when I remember the first time I did acid, I was like, I don't feel any different. Seriously, I didn't.
Really?
Yeah.
I actually, that is one I haven't dabbled in.
Oh, well, so it was the first time. I mean, I'm done with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Luke Thompson and I were going to do. No, I won't say that. I just would be kidding anyway. But, yeah, I think that to kind of shift though, I'll bring up like a question because I talked with James Cortides about a little bit about psychedelics, and I know he talks about it on his channel to some degree. And he's had his experiences, and I've had mine. My experiences on them have been pretty positive, but I've only used them maybe a handful of times in my life. So it's not like something that I spend like all kinds of time doing. But what I found is kind of like what you found is like, well, it's kind of like the shortcut into a lot of things that your mind can get to anyway. Like it kind of puts you there in a sense of immediacy, but it's not too terribly different than that imaginary world.
I always feel like it's like the Disney movie. It's like way too colorful. The soundtrack is really kitschig. Like the imaginary world that I live in, like when I take a wander on my property, it feels way, way better than the one that I have experienced on mushrooms or peyote or, acid or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
all those various substances.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's why I actually don't have any desire to do any drugs anymore.
Will I do a fringe encounter with Grim? Yeah, that'd be fun. Let him know I'd do it. We just got to set it up. I think Grim and I come from such vastly different perspectives. That could be a very interesting conversation. I like Grim.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm like, what? And that's from a guy who does, I have weird thinking. Yeah. And so I haven't ever shared this in a public way, but I think it might be interesting, and I don't mind it being in public. It's okay. At some point I figured I'd tell people about this. So I'll share one of my experiences with psychedelics. It was powerful. And very positive. And I was going through a few years back. This was right. I was going through a divorce in 2019 and had been separated from my ex for, I think, 4 years before that. So it was a really painful period in my life. And then COVID hit shortly after, and my company went under. So I lost healthcare. I didn't have, access to like my ability to get therapy and regular bipolar medications, all that kind of stuff. And so I was down. I was pretty depressed. I mean, it wasn't like,
sounds like it.
It wasn't the worst depression I've ever, well, it was pretty bad.
Yeah.
It was a pretty low one. And I had a friend, and she just said, "Hey, Jed, I know you're really fighting through it. I've got some mushrooms. If you ever want to try it," she says, "it can really, I felt like it really helped me break the back of a depression." She says, "It's not going to make you not depressed, but it will help kind of, you can get some breakthrough."
Mm-hmm.
I was like, well, okay, and I was a little apprehensive about it, but I was like, well, if I don't have anywhere I got to be, so I just was like, what the heck, I'll try.
Timing was perfect.
I was like, Lord, is this something and I just felt like I was okay to try, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I did, and I was just kind of like listening to music and laying in my bed, and there were two this was right around the time I was also beginning to read Jordan's doctoral thesis. That's now the book that he's published. I was reading through that. And one of the first encounters I had was with Maximus the Confessor. And it was an interesting encounter because the way he appeared, the way the hallucinatory experience appeared, he looked like like he would in an icon, like an icon drawing. It's kind of, but it was kind of this sense of a living icon.
Right.
But in the icon that he had, you could see his hand that was cut, his right hand that was cut off. And you could see the blood coming out of his hand, from his wrist. And you could see the blood coming from his mouth because his tongue was removed.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember and it stayed in that image stayed in front of me. It felt like for quite some time. And it felt deeply personal. Like I had encountered his personality in some sense in that encounter. And like, because when I was reading through Jordan's book, and I had read some Maximus and began reading more Maximus as a result of Jordan's book, I was struck by the beauty of the man's mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like there's not many theologians that I've read. He's very difficult, but he writes beautifully.
Mm-hmm.
And I was struck with this sense of like, this is the cost of beauty in the world. Is you've got to be willing to bleed for it. It was a really powerful encounter of like, I think he knew in his mind, like he had touched upon something profoundly real, and, was willing to stick to his guns, even though it meant, having his tongue cut out and his hand cut off, and eventually dies from those injuries.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that as like, there was this like release in my heart, I think, of like, oh, in this world, like there's a certain kind of suffering that cannot be escaped. And there's a certain kind of suffering that you will invite upon yourself if you choose to walk your path.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it was
Job is a really
powerful.
good example of that. I mean, Job shows us that
Mm-hmm.
because he clings to his integrity, right? That's and it's, it's so interesting because he's literally like lost everything. He has his wife, but his
Mm-hmm.
children are gone, his home is gone, his businesses are gone, his clothes are gone, his skin is gone.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? He's sitting in ashes, covered in sores. He said even the worst people on the outside of the city gates are mocking me. Like they're singing songs about me now. Like, in ridicule. Like he's just like and he's like whittled right down to just that thing that he has to hang on to. And God calls it righteous.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty interesting to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
The thing that says, I never did anything wrong. I never did it and I want a face to face. And what the is going on here? Like what's going on? Right? George MacDonald says he makes a claim on his creator as the creature. And as the creature, he has the right to make that claim. And it's interesting because I think that is one of the greatest shows or demonstrations or manifestations of faith,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is when you demand an answer
Mm-hmm.
from God. It's yeah. And you don't get there if you haven't lost everything.
Mm-hmm.
Like where you demand an answer from God. How
Yeah.
many people are like shaking their fist at the sky? Only those who are suffering,
Mm-hmm.
honestly. Really?
Yeah. Well, I think I've told you this before, like, and actually that psychedelic experience a couple weeks later, there was a real breakthrough for me.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
and,
Nice.
and there was, I was kind of still, just working through the hurt of the divorce, but that touches on it brought me into a place that was connected to all the other things that I had suffered through. I felt like I was
Mhm.
dealing with the cumulative sense of the suffering, not just going through that. And I felt God's presence very palpably and I felt very isolated from it at the same time because like I was holding on to something.
Yeah.
He just said, just say it, Jed, just say it. Right. I think I've told you this before. And, um, and it took me like probably 2 hours before I could even utter the words out of my mouth. It was like, you let this happen,
Yeah.
and his answer was like shocking. It wasn't like, I was thinking like, okay, finally I said it. You're going to come in and console me. And like his answer was, I let everything happen, Jed.
Yeah.
Do you trust me? And I was like, well, shit. I'm like,
This
I
is
mean,
not
what else
helpful.
can I say to that? I mean, yeah, I guess if you're going to let everything happen, what's the option of trust or not trust?
Right.
Am I any better off for not trusting you if you're letting everything happen?
Yeah.
And it's like, and there was a sense of that because everything that has happened in the whole history of this whole world is because God has let it happen.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean he always actively wills it to happen. I think there's a difference there, but he lets everything happen. And, and I think that like, that was where that was a real turning point in my life. And it's not like it's all roses sense because I go through the realities of the struggle that I go through
Mhm.
every day. I live with it every
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
But it changed my perspective where I realized like, I think at that point in my life, I was still looking at the idea that I would get to a point in life where I would get beyond the suffering.
Mhm.
I would overcome it. And then things would be okay.
Mhm.
Right. And that
Yeah,
was
this is the idea of repose that I read out of McDonald's essay
yeah.
there, right? Where people think that they're gonna get to this place of repose, right?
Yeah.
But No, we're called into a noble unrest.
Yeah. And there's like a sense where you have to you have to come to terms with your suffering. And I have to remind myself of that now still regularly, because
Sure.
I'll get pretty
Nobody
wound
wants
around
to.
the axle over any number of things, whether they're legitimate or just little stupid, silly annoyances. But then there's also like that voice in the back of my head of like bringing me back into myself.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a part of the self that doesn't suffer at all.
It's true.
And is the observer, observes the part of you that does suffer.
Mm-hmm.
And you can have an active conversation with that part of yourself that observes, and has to slow things down and says, Jed, it looks like you're having a hard time. What's
Mm-hmm.
going on? What are you feeling? And then all of a sudden you realize like, I can go through any range of feelings and emotion, good and bad, but I can always come back to that center place. And I really do. For me, I identify that with what Paul talks about in Galatians 2:20, right? The I that's crucified so that Christ lives in you, is like, that's your access to Christ, is the center point where you can go to that place and hear from him and hear from the observer and endure whatever it is that the body and the flesh have to endure in this life.
Mm.
And there is a sense of endurance. Anselman, that's a really interesting question. Yes, is my answer.
What a bummer for an answer, eh? It's always yes.
Yeah, like almost any either or question to me is like, what do we mean by already determined? Like, so to drill in and give you like a more satisfying answer, because I know that's kind of short. Like my sense of like how things are determined, I believe that the beginning and the end are determined, right? And the beginning and the end are actually basically one and the same thing. The alpha and the omega point is its own singularity, and everything in between the beginning and the end is somewhat undetermined, like a determined indeterminacy that leads to a determined end, right? And so like the example I would say is like the end state of an oak tree, of an acorn, is an oak tree. That's determined, right? The seed determines what it is, but the path it takes to grow into and the shape it takes as an oak tree, one oak tree versus the next, there's room for infinite variation and the stochastic elements of chance and all that kind of stuff that will make each tree grow differently, but each tree is going to become what it had it in it to be as in its own seed form. And so I think that there is a sense where the future is very open. And I don't try to remove God's providential hand at work in that either, because I do think that God is also guiding history. But I think it's more in the way that, like, a gardener tends to tends to the hedges and like there's a shaping that happens, but it not a hard and fast intervention, if that makes sense, for the most part. I mean, maybe there's exceptional events like, I don't know, parting of the Red Sea or the resurrection, or, like certain things that are clearly like divine eruptions into history. But for the most part, I think that there's a large degree of openness and indeterminacy in creation, and that God's presence in that indeterminacy, not in a way that I'm not an open theist, in the normal sense of things. I think there's maybe some insights there that are worth taking a look at, but I see it all determined in the sense that it's already conceived of in the mind of God, but he allows it to freely grow into that. And so the shape and structure.
Well, I gotta read you something here. This might help to make sense of what you're getting at. Here we go. As to what thought is in the mind of God before it takes form, or what the form is to him before he utters it. In a word, what the consciousness of God is in either case, all we can say is that our consciousness is in the resembling conditions must afar off resemble his. But when we come to consider the acts embodying the divine thought, and then in brackets he has, if indeed thought and act be not one with him, one and the same, then we enter a region of large difference. We discover at once, for instance, that where a man would make a machine or a picture or a book, God makes the man that makes the book or the picture or the machine. Would God give us a drama? He makes a Shakespeare. Or would he construct a drama more immediately his own? He begins with the building of the stage itself. And that stage is a world, a universe of worlds. He makes the actors, and they do not act. They are their part. He utters them into the visible to work out their life, his drama. When he would have an epic, he sends a thinking hero into his drama, and the epic is the soliloquy of his Hamlet. Instead of writing his lyrics, he sets his birds and his maidens a-singing. All the processes of the ages are God's science. All the flow of history is his poetry. So there you go. George says it's so great.
Jason asked an interesting question, kind of a follow-up to Anselman's here, the 525 question. Again, yes, Jason. So, I mean, because God is everywhere and in all things present, I think that he first of all, I don't know what God knows. So I will just say you're asking a question and I'm going to give you an answer, but I don't know if my answer is correct. But I think that because God is present in all things, that he knows all things.
Anselman said, good answer. Thanks.
Oh, thanks. But like, I also think there's a sense of like, God, goes back into the kind of the vacancy and the emptiness and the darkness of God. There is a sense where God withdraws himself from creation so it can grow into itself. So he's not telling the branch to grow in this angle toward the sun in this way because of, it's like all that's conditioned on a billion different factors, right on down to like how the neutrinos are spinning at the
well, just speaking from a farmer perspective, if I have young animals, like let's say a lamb that is orphaned or a goat kid that's orphaned, or even a chick from a chicken, the worst thing I can do is raise it myself. It's almost like writing it a death sentence. If I spent all my time with this animal, making sure that it, never bumped itself and never, always had enough food and never went hungry, and which I would do, right, as a human being, because I would think about all those things. So the best thing for me to do is, and it sounds harsh, but like when I was bottle feeding baby goats or whatever, they only got so many bottles a day, and then they were hungry, and they had to figure things out.
Yeah.
And they had to make mistakes, and they had to hurt themselves.
Well, in a sense, that's how they discover themselves.
Exactly. And if they don't do that, if they don't suffer, okay, because they're in with a herd, and none of those goats want them around them, right? They're like, get away from me, right? You nasty little child. You're not mine. Yeah, they just won't survive.
Yeah,
they won't. I had a chicken who decided, because she was not the same color as all the other chickens, and so she got ostracized, and she just made friends with me. Like when I would feed the chickens, she would come and sit on my foot. And finally one day I looked at her and I thought, are you actually trying to be with me? And so I picked her up, and she just was so happy, right? And she was just a little chick. And so then I started favoring her and giving her food and waiting for her to get enough and, all this stuff. And you know what happened to her? She walked straight into the mouth of a coyote.
Well, and you missed a golden opportunity to put her in a pot.
No, she was an egg-laying chicken.
I know.
But
Okay.
but
Well,
yeah,
and
and then
Jason,
I got another chicken like that, and I decided not to do that with her.
uh-huh.
So, yeah.
And she knew how to survive.
Well, she's still working on it.
But Jason, there's a second side to your question. I think God knows all things in Christ. So I was working on I was pulling up on my phone. I keep notes in my phone. And like, I think that when we're looking at when the Father begets the Son, he creates everything. And so I think he sees creation through his Son. And so that's how he knows creation. He knows creation as Christ knows creation, right? Because he's the image of the invisible God, right? And he's the image, he's the logos of creation. So I think that there is a sense where whatever God knows in the created realm, he knows it in and through Christ, through whom all things are created. But I wanted to back up to something that Shari said, and I wanted to run this idea past you, but I was thinking about this just the other day in relation to suffering. Like, there's a sense where I think that all finite things have to suffer. It is the nature of finitude to suffer. If we get
Yeah.
into grace and
Well,
nature.
this is my thing about, like our limitations, our finitude, our container is time and our bodies, right? This is what we like. If you crack the egg, what happens? It just goes everywhere. Like
Mhm.
when I was struggling with anxiety and depression and all that stuff, I felt like an egg. I felt that was the only thing I could use to describe me was that I was a thin-shelled egg. And then at some points, I felt like there was no shell and just the membrane. Sometimes
Mhm.
you find an egg like that, right? Where a chicken lays an egg and there's just a membrane and no shell.
Mhm.
Um, so it's contained, but it's very fragile. And you poke it and it spreads out all over the place, right? Well, so we need a container, and this is it. And this container hurts. Like that's what it does.
Mhm.
You know
Or
the
like
you
John
know
Bear says, the earth that suffers.
yeah, and I mean, you think about it, your body is a fantastic little hospital, right? Because that's all it's doing. It's constantly repairing itself. Why? Because it's under duress. Like it's because it's falling apart.
Mhm.
Always. It's
Mhm.
always something's going wrong, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely.
Just in your flesh, like just in your body. Like that's not the stuff that you're aware of.
Mhm.
That's the stuff you're not aware of, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Stuff is
So
dying in your body every second of every day. And Anselman, you had an interesting comment here about erring on the side of maximum human agency under God's loving guidance and interaction. I completely agree with you. And I think that when, this was one of my struggles when I was, kind of fully in and engaged within Calvinism. And I can't say that this is everybody's experience, but this was mine, is that because I believed that God had determined everything, it it distanced me from the value of my own choices in a way, and it became a means for me to surrender agency, right? So like I just felt helpless to things that were happening in my life, and so I was just kind of carried along with this sense of almost fate or destiny, and not in a positive sense, but just like, well, this is my life now, I guess. Like, this was predestined to be what it's going to be, and all those kinds of things. And it was spiritually damaging for me personally. And it wasn't until I had spent some time reading the fathers that began to kind of burn away from my thinking. Is
mhm.
I think that like the there is a real liberation, a real work of liberation that happens at the cross that allows us to have a genuine freedom and real
Mhm.
agency and real choices to make. And I think that's maybe a through line in this whole conversation that Shari and I are having, is like, God wants his kids to grow up. He doesn't want us to just constantly be sitting in a
Well,
position where
that's
he
exactly
needs to
the
tell us what to do. Like, we have to make choices.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you know who God is, like if I know who my dad is, and I know my dad pretty well, I have a good idea of how, like, I don't need to ask him, hey dad, how should I do this? Or how do you think I should do this? I know what his answer is already, you know? So, you know, and I was, it lingered for me for about a decade.
I just walked in the valley of the shadow of Calvinism. Like, I didn't even know there was anything else
Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
long time. And
Yeah.
then all of
And
a sudden I was like, oh, really?
yeah, and
Catholics
I'm
are
not saying every Calvinist is like spiritually unhealthy or anything like that, but I know that for me, that has been my experience. You know, so I'm not here to like knock on people who maybe are still Calvinists or whatever. Fine.
I'm just
Totally
talking
fine.
about me too. Yeah.
But like it definitely, like, learning that, like, you know, there's an emancipation that's taking place at Calvary that enables it gives weight and meaning to the choices that I make.
Well, the idea that maximum human agency is necessary is exactly what I was trying to illustrate with my bottle-fed baby goat.
Yeah.
It has to be a goat. It can't be I can't,
Can't be Sherry's baby forever.
no. It has to be a baby. It has to be a goat, and it has to act like a goat, and it has to run into other goats, and it has to have problems with those goats, and then it,
Mhm.
and figure it out. And that is maximum agency for that goat. Like, that's what that is when I leave it alone. And we started this out, Jed, with the absence of God, right? Well,
Mhm.
in that baby goat's case, God is absent. Like, I'm God,
Mhm.
right? And I'm its comfort. I'm supplying all its needs. But for its own good, I have to leave it alone.
Yeah. Well, we went through that when we were raising our kids. Like, and every parenting book will tell you something different. So the ones we went to, and it worked for us. So
Mhm.
but to be able to get our kids to where they were comfortable sleeping alone in their crib, whether it was, in our room or in the kids' room, like, we had to let them cry.
Mhm.
And a lot of times it's like those cries became like, by the time they're like 3, 4, 5, 6 months old, like those cries turn into like real temper tantrums,
Oh, yeah.
and you realize, like, your impulse, even as a parent, is like, I want to intervene. But if I keep intervening, like, because you learn the language of your kids' cry, like,
Yeah, yeah.
poopy diaper cry, I'm hurt cry, or I'm
Yeah.
just mad and I want you to come in and rescue me cry, right? They're
Mhm.
all
Mhm.
different. And so you kind of have to learn to differentiate that as a parent. But, our kids had to learn how to sleep on their own. And the way they learned how to do that was they had to cry in our absence. Now, we had those baby monitors,
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was like we're never fully gone, but it sounds about right for you, Luke. Let's be
Well, as
honest.
a mother, they were never out of earshot. I could hear them no matter where they were. It was crazy.
Dad of the year. But yeah, you gotta let your kids cry a little bit, and it sucks as a parent. You like, everything in you says, "Hey, I want my kid to stop crying." Sometimes you selfishly want them to just shut up, But
I have to tell you that I was a single mom for 3 years before I met my husband.
Mhm.
And I had an infant, and we were going through that phase. And of course, with her and I, it was even worse because we just had each other, right? So, and she slept
Mhm.
in my bed, and
Mhm.
then all of a sudden, I decided she had to sleep in her own bed, in her own room,
Mhm.
and so we were going through this thing where I'd pat her back and sing a little song and everything, and then when she'd fall asleep, I'd tiptoe out. And as soon as I touched the door, she'd be like, and I don't know how many hours I went through this with her this one night, and I was just like, and I didn't have anybody to take over. It was just me and her, right?
Mhm.
And I was losing it, and I could feel myself getting really frustrated, and I thought, I have to leave because I don't hurt her, you know?
Mhm.
And I went out of the room, and I don't know, I threw something that I had in my hand, and I said to God, "You call yourself a husband? Do something about that." Right? And I said it out loud, and then all of a sudden, It was silent. I was like, no. And she fell asleep. And this had been going on, and it was like she was well aware, like, by the time I went back in the room, she was standing on the crib smiling. And yeah.
Yeah, that the evidently God is very interested in letting us grow up, which
yeah, Jess tells this beautiful story of how he was like my friend there who was asking about, what should I wear? He wasn't like that, but he was very dependent on what God wanted him to do, and he didn't want to do anything that God didn't want him to do, right? And he sensed one particular day, and I'm telling Jess's story for him, but he's not here, so that God wasn't going to give him an answer. He there was something that he wanted an answer to, and he wasn't getting it, right? And he remembers the day exactly the way he describes it. And he thought to himself, he said to God, you're letting me go, aren't you? And God said, yeah. You had to find out, he needed to find out what it was that he wanted.
That is the question, isn't it? Like we always ask God, what do you want? But when God asks you, what do you want? What do you want?
What do you want? And the thing is, when you answer that question, you have to find that the answer to that question is found out in the journey of becoming who you are, right? Because you don't know what you want. Yeah, it's a beautiful story, Luke. We just can't. I almost wanted to cry just telling it, because Jess always cries when he tells it. But it's like you can't answer that question if you don't know who you are. What do I want?
Well, and there's like this process. There's like this weird contradictory process that's going on there, if you think about it, because it's like, well, I think I want this, so I'm going to go after it, and then you find out that's not what you wanted.
Yeah, because it's not who you are.
The next thing, but then you're coming back, and like at some point you have to come into a point in your life where all your little wants don't add up to desire, right? Because it's like, I think when God asks us that question of what do you want, he's asking you the deeper question of who are you? Do you know who you are?
That's right. That's right.
And then you have to take responsibility for your own desires.
Yeah.
And that was the part of, like, I remember when God asked me that question for the first time, and I was just like, I don't know. I had to answer honestly. I'm like, I don't know what I want. I mean, ask me in 15 minutes, it's going to be different than what I answer right now, and so I think that like that's the growing up process, and the withdrawal and the God forsakenness that we have to go through is like gives us the
this one first.
Yeah.
Know thyself.
Yeah.
Sounds
super
simple,
easy. I've got it licked.
But it takes a long time.
Yeah, well, there's like all kinds of false starts and detours, and somehow it like adds up to the journey, at least if you're making the attempt.
Douglas Harding has that 4 Stages of Life video that if anybody hasn't seen it, it's just Google 4 Stages of Life, Douglas Harding, and it'll come up. It's 15 minutes. And he says, the teenager stands in front of the mirror, and suddenly they're confronted with their image, and they believe that what they are what they look like. Okay. And he says that that's actually hell. And most people stay in that stage of development. They believe that they are what they look like. And then he says, but you are not, because what you look like is death, but what you are is living, right? Is life. And that's what you have. I think that's the biggest hurdle to get over, is, I equate that 4 Stages of Life video to Barfield's original participation, withdrawal, right?
Mhm.
What you're talking about, and final participation. And for Douglas Harding, that's the toddler, the teenager, and the sage, right?
Mhm.
Where the sage then reintegrates the toddler. And this is Jesus saying you have to become like a little child, right?
And that's kind of
And
also the Platonic structure of emanation, which
well,
is
yeah, yeah,
you proceed, you return, and at all times you remain within yourself.
yeah.
And it's like that procession and return is like, in a sense, you have to, before you, it's a sense of like the shorthand way of saying is like coming full circle, right? Is like you
How
return to
about coming
yourself.
full spiral? So it's
Yeah.
not like
Yeah.
closed.
It's not like a one-time journey.
Yeah,
It is this, it keeps
yeah,
going and
yeah.
moving forward. But there, like, we can't, like, that is, I think, one of the toughest things that, like, when I get a sense of like what that is like, there's a sense where we're in that process, like the creation ex nihilo is happening now. It's not happening some point in the past, it's happening now. We're being called out of nothing and having to grow from this 0 point into something.
Mhm, mhm.
and 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 a lot of that is predicated on that whole question of self-knowledge. Well, the question is, what is the self that you are knowing? And I'll use an example, and then I'll hand it off to you, and then I got about 15 minutes, then I do
I
need to
do too, actually. I
handle
was
some
just looking at the
things. But
time and I need to go
I
too.
was the other night I was meditating, and I was meditating on that question of what the self is, especially like in light of what Paul has to say in Galatians 2:20 about the I have been crucified in Christ, no longer I
Right,
live,
right.
but Christ lives in me. Is there's a shared life. And I would go so far as to say there's a shared self. The true self is Christ in you, right?
Right.
And so like I had like this picture or this image of, in a sense, like, so I'm sitting on a circular table, but like, so I was seeing was kind of like my circular, I had like this little coffee table, like not a
Mhm.
coffee table, but a little breakfast table, right?
Yep.
And I was picturing this table, and the table was like a body of water that was functioning like a mirror. And what Christ was asking me to do was to reach out for him. And then he reached out for me. So I'm on one side of the table that's now water, covered in water.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
he's holding the other side. And he says, now let's talk. Because we have this shared space between us, this shared self. And and so I think like the invitation to discover yourself is the invitation to discover God.
Oh, yeah.
And like what was interesting is, as we began to converse, I was like, well, I'm like, Jesus, why do you sound so much like me? He's like, that's the way I sound to everybody. Like, we hear him in our voice, we
Mhm,
hear him in
mhm.
our thoughts. And you realize, like, when you're connected with God, you're thinking together or imagining together. It's a togetherness. There's a lover and a beloved relationship there that is gathering off of the shared territory. Like, so when Jesus says like love your neighbor as yourself, he means that quite literally. I
Mhm.
think, like, in the sense of that your neighbor is yourself. And so like you are seeing yourself uniquely in your neighbor. And so, and Christ sees himself uniquely in each one of us.
Yeah.
So the body of Christ is not complete, if you want me to make my universalist plug, until each and every one of us
Mhm.
has joined in that pleroma of humanity, the
Right.
broader pleroma of humanity. Like, he sees himself in us, and see ourselves in him. And there's that mirroring that has to take place, and it's that shared. It's a mystery. I wish I had language for it.
Right.
But I
Yeah.
think that there's that invitation into that kind of shared life. And so in order to get there, you have to go and engage a journey that entails suffering. And And I think that like, that's where, we all struggle with that because suffering is not pleasant. But then there becomes a point where I think you get to an evenness of mind. I have my moments where like, I just will have a lot of chaos going on, I'll have a really busy day at work, 9 different people yelling, angry, have a
Yeah.
lot of heaviness going on during the day. And there are those times where it's like, if I can stay within that sense of shared self with myself and Christ, like I'm okay.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that any of the interactions are particularly pleasant,
Right.
or
Right.
anything like that. But it doesn't mean that like, even in the suffering that like I said, there is a part of the self that doesn't suffer, that's untouched, but the suffering can never touch.
Yeah.
But you have to learn to get there. And it's suffering that drives you into the discovery of that. And I think that's almost like what the Buddha was talking about in his own way. Yep. Yeah, we totally. Clearly, Luke, why aren't you in this conversation teaching us?
I remember when my son was being born, he had a huge head. And just as he was crowning, I was just doing the thing. I was very stoic. I was a very stoic, birthing person.
Mhm.
And he was crowning and it really hurt. And I remember going, this really hurts, I said to my husband, that was my big complaining moment.
Well, if you're going to complain at any point in your life, I think my son was like that. They actually had to use the suction thing to get him out.
Oh boy.
So it looked like he had like a little yarmulke. It was interesting to
My
watch.
son looked like a cone head when he was born because
Yeah.
his head was so big that it squished
Had to
right
do a lot
down
of
to get out.
squeezing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was really he had a flat forehead and yeah.
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 Yeah. It's interesting how birthing is crazy. It's the wildest thing. Like it is.
But my favorite story about suffering, maybe we'll end on this,
Yes.
is I was in a car accident and got a really bad whiplash, and I didn't know it until 6 or 7 hours later, and I was just my head was stuck and it couldn't lift it, and
Mhm.
and I had 3 little kids and a busy life, and I was just like, "No," not interested. I was not interested in having a whiplash, right? And I remember just thinking, I didn't have time. Like, I was like, "I don't have time for this shit." You know? Kind of what I was thinking. And then I heard, "Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice." And I was like, "Give me a break." Right? And then I heard it again, and I'm like, "Oh my god. Oh, fine then." And I grabbed the car keys, jumped in the car, drove up into a forest because we lived in Switzerland and all the houses are like, this close together. Drove up into a forest, walked into the forest as far as I could, and then I said, "All right, fine, I'm here. I'm rejoicing, okay? Thanks for the whiplash. Thank you very much." And then all of a sudden I started weeping and I, honestly, I know it took me a long time to get over it, but I don't remember anything bad after that. Like somehow it made all the difference. Like, because then in the end, I was actually grateful,
Mhm.
right? And I was actually rejoicing. And then I came home and I don't know, I guess I cruised through it,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Gratitude changes a lot.
Mhm.
A lot.
Yeah.
Um, I woke up in a bad mood today, and I had to like,
Mhm.
I was like, oh, it's Monday. Like I had just, I didn't want to go to work. I just want to stay in
You
bed.
don't like Mondays?
Just really comfortable in there. And I woke up and I was surly from the beginning,
Yeah.
and I step into my office and I get in work pretty early. I was at work at about 5:30 this morning. And I stepped in the office kind of still stewing in my bad mood. And it occurred to me, I'm like, okay, well, God, I need to give you at least some thanks for something. And it just like a couple things came to mind, and then a couple more things came to mind, and a couple more things came to mind. And I realized it's like, oh man, like, sometimes it's like you look at the problem in front of you, it looks so big of just, I'm mad, and when we're grumpy, we're not,
Yeah.
but it's just like sometimes like even the insertion of just a little bit of gratitude brings perspective. It didn't necessarily, make the things I was annoyed about any less annoying, but just that gratitude, it changes things a lot. It
Yeah.
definitely does.
My
So,
sister went, she had to fly to Vancouver yesterday, and she goes, I'm just bummed because I can't bring my pillow. And I'm like, what? What do you mean you can't bring your pillow? She goes, well, it weighs like 10 pounds. It's a memory foam pillow. She goes, and I can't sleep without it. I hate hotel pillow. And then she goes, oh my God, listen to us. I'm having first world problems. And like my sister has grown up, married, and like birthed children basically in a wall tent in the middle of the wilderness, right? So,
yeah.
and now she's at a point in her life where she's bummed out she can't take her memory foam pillow on a plane. She's like, wait a minute. I'm so glad that she caught herself on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Luke, we're grateful for you too, brother.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's been almost 2 hours, Jed. That's pretty good.
I think so too.
Sorry, Nate, that we didn't get to all the questions. I couldn't find them.
We got to
what
half
happened?
of the question though.
Did I lose you, Jedediah?
I've lost you, so I think it's just the perfect time to hang up.
Yeah. You froze for me for some reason.
You're frozen on my end. I can see me. You probably can't see me.
You can hear me though?
There we go. Now you're back.
Okay.
Just in time for us to say goodbye.
Yes. Goodbye, Jed. Thank you so much.
Take
Bye,
care.
everybody.